All right, so we made it to Unit 3, which is Sensation and Perception. Couple of things to know about this unit is that it's actually comprises the smallest percentage of AP test questions. Okay, so that's not to say let's not take it seriously. That's just to say that this does make up a smaller portion of the AP exam, though I do think it's fascinating and important. Okay, and so the way that you'll be tested on this unit, a bit different than Unit 1 and Unit 2. There's going to be a very small multiple choice test, and then we'll be doing our very first graded, like for real, notes closed FRQ. Okay, so that's coming up. Also, what's important to note is that over the course of the next week or so, things are going to be a little funky as we prepare to move to hybrid learning. So a lot of this unit is going to be you working through it on your own. Okay, I'm always here to set up a Zoom if you need help with the concept. I'll definitely be checking in, but note that this unit is one of our smaller units and is going to be one that you work on a bit more on your own than we've done before. And then once we hop into Unit 4 on learning, we'll kind of go back to our normal. So when we say sensation and perception, what are we talking about? Okay, sensation, textbook definition, is the process that our sensory receptors and nervous system receive and represent various stimuli. Hopefully it's kind of coming full circle now why we looked at nerves, why we looked at the brain. It's because it actually helps us to understand how we experience reality. Okay, so sensation is experiencing through the senses, while perception is the process of organizing and interpreting sensory information, aka how does the brain process it? Okay, so sensation, how do we experience the world through our senses? And then perception is how the brain processes it. Okay, the picture that I used here is of a baby tasting ice cream the first time, right? So this baby, and there's a lot of these cute YouTube videos if you ever want to see people, little kids eating something for the first time. Okay, they're experiencing it through their taste, and then their brain is processing it. Sugar is rushing through their body, all kinds of probably nice little dopamine releases going on because it's so delicious. And so how does this baby think about and process the eating of ice cream? They do it through their senses. So the book talks about two different kinds of processing, okay? And the first kind of processing is bottom-up processing. And this is an analysis that begins with the senses and works up to the brain, okay? And this is the less common kind of processing. And it's the processing we do maybe a lot more as kids or when we're in brand new situation, okay? So we start with visual information, we put it together in order to kind of see a bigger picture, okay? So think about doing a puzzle. You have all of these pieces and you're trying to organize it to get this to this whole piece. You're trying to figure out what is this thing, right? Imagine if you put somebody in the forest for a first time who's never seen trees or anything like that, they would have to be piecing together information to understand kind of where they are in what context, okay? Like I said, this is the less common kind of processing. Most of us use top-down processing because we've lived now in the world for quite a while, and we kind of have our own expectations and understanding of the world. Okay, so top-down processing is guided by higher level mental process where we construct perceptions drawing on our experience and expectations. Okay, so take a look at that sentence over there. Okay, just looking at it quickly, I can read, do you find this simple to read? Because of the phenomenal power of the human mind, most people do, right? This is a totally misspelled sentence. However, for you to be able to read this is top-down processing because you're able to piece together things from your own experience of seeing these words before. Even though they're jumbled, your brain quickly unscrambles them. You're using your experience of the world, of reading, of what it probably says, even if a word is hard, because you have enough experience in the world. Okay, so that's top down. Bottom up is piecing everything together to get to a whole. Top down is really looking at all of your own experiences, and perceptions in order to kind of chisel down at what something really means or what something is. Here is just another way of seeing this. Okay, so bottom-up processing is taking sensory information and then assembling it and integrating it into what am I seeing, right? Imagine that person in the forest for the first time. Top-down process uses modules, ideas, and expectations to interpret sensory information. Is this something I've seen before? Okay, I maybe never saw people spelled that way before, but I have certain ideas of what is coming in that sentence based on my experience. I also have seen that word several times and I'm able to easily unscramble it. Okay, so the stuff we're about to get into is really difficult to talk about on a video, and I think would be much more powerful in person where we can demonstrate it or watch some videos together. So I'm going to do my best, but I'm also going to be linking in a couple of videos for you to watch that I think are really good, and they're also really short, okay? So let's talk about attention. I know a lot of us think that we can multitask, and a lot of us do, right? We have our phone out, we might be watching something, and we might be doing our homework all at the same time, but it's impossible for the brain to focus on multiple things at once, despite if we want to believe that we're fantastic multitaskers or not. Most of us are just very talented at going back and forth between different things going on in the world, okay? So selective attention is the focusing of our conscious awareness on a particular stimulus, okay? And the opposite of that would be selective inattention. And what I'd like you guys to do at the end of this video is to watch this awareness test, okay? I'm gonna link it here. You probably already have some insight into what it is based on the reading with the people with the inattentional blindness, which is the failing to see visible objects when our attention is directed elsewhere, right? It's like how most of us probably wish we could text and drive, but kind of realizing the science behind this and realizing how incredibly dangerous that actually is, even when we believe we're paying full attention to something, okay? Another video that I want you to watch is on change blindness, and that's people failing to notice changes in the environment, okay? It's also called the door study. That's just one example of change blindness. They talked about it in the book, but I actually want you to watch it and to be thinking, do you think that you would be one of those people that would fail to see people sort of changing in your environment and you not even realizing it, okay? These are going to be really important concepts to get in your notes, and we'll do some more with this stuff down the road. All right, so the next concept is called transduction. So transduction is the conversion of one form of energy into another, okay? In sensation, that is the transforming of the stimulus energies, the sight, sound, smells, things that we process with our senses, into neural impulses that our brain can interpret, okay? If none of that made sense, I hope that this video does, or not video, this picture does, right? We see, okay, we're making coffee, right? We are seeing light, we hear sound of the coffee being made, it smells probably delicious, right? Those are all sensations, okay? And it moves from just being a sensation out into the world, and it moves into our sensory receptors. It creates action potentials and neurons firing, and then our brain is able to perceive what's going on. And depending our feelings of coffee and our experiences and our memories, all that has to do with how we process it. Okay, so that's transduction. Taking stimuli from the outside world and it being sort of processed by our brains and actually felt and experienced in a real way that we can actually articulate and talk about. Psychophysics, just kind of a quick second on this. It's a branch of psychology that studies the relationship between the physical characteristics of something and our psychological experience of it. And that's kind of what I talked about with transduction. It's really looking at how the brain processes something. So how can two people watch coffee being made, or two people can stub their toe, and people have different thresholds for pain or different experiences around something. And so even though they're intaking the same stimulus, their experience of it can be slightly or really majorly different. All right, so the book also gets into thresholds. And an absolute threshold, I see that I made a slight typo there. It's not an absolutely threshold, it's an absolute threshold, but just for the sake of time, we'll go with it. And that's the minimum stimulus energy needed to detect something 50% of the time. So I want you to think about, you've probably all been to the doctor where they put the headset on you. I especially remember doing this as a kid, and you have the doctor who's pressing a button and you're hearing different sounds, okay? And so as a kid, I remember like having to raise my hand or do something to signal that I've heard the sound. And some of the sounds are really faint. Also, sometimes people might think that they hear a sound because they expect it coming, but they don't, okay? So an absolute threshold, let's say for instance for hearing, would be a certain noise level that you would be able to hear at least 50% of the time. Maybe not 100% of the time because it's so faint, but your absolute threshold is that minimum bit of sound or that minimum bit of light that you would be able to process at least 50% of the time. Anything that's below that we would call subliminal, and that means that it's not significant enough for us to be able to detect it, okay? And we'll do, when we actually really get into hearing, I'll give you guys some examples of that so you guys can try it on yourselves and your family members. Another thing I find fascinating is the signal detection theory, which predicts how and when we're going to detect a faint stimulus. So part of it has to do with the stimulus itself. Is it really loud? Is it really bright? Does it smell really intensely? And also, it depends partly on one's experience, expectations, motivations, and alertness. So the thing I think about this when I think of the signal detection theory, you probably have some teachers who notice the second that you're out of uniform, or teachers who notice the second that you pull your phone out. Other teachers, not so much. It's not necessarily that they don't see it. Some people are just predisposed to seeing things like that, making senses about something while others don't. And it might not be that we don't hear it, see it, or smell it. It might be that we do, but that it's just so subtle we don't even process it. Okay, so think about those things. What are the things that you're acutely aware of that somebody else might not be? We also hear of the difference threshold, which is the just noticeable difference. Okay, so it's the minimum difference between two stimuli or two pictures or two something required to be able to detect it. Okay, so if I flashed a bunch of soda cans in front of your face and they were all this, and then I flashed in one or two of these, would you be able to notice it, that the Coke can has slightly changed? Okay, and once again, with these thresholds, the absolute threshold and the difference threshold, we're just required to be able to detect it 50% of the time, so not even 100. So here's a concept that I find fascinating, and you read about it in Blink by Malcolm Gladwell this summer, and that's the concept of priming. And that's the way that our unconscious is activated and makes associations. So there's even studies where they ask people to pretend to be a college professor, right? Think like a college professor, act like a college professor, and then they play Trivial Pursuit. And those people who have pretended to be a college professor do better than those that didn't, okay? So for instance, too, right? I could be using this as a primer right now. For instance, if I said, I want you to think of a fruit, right? My guess is that many of you might think of like a banana or a pineapple because I've primed you guys to be thinking about the color, right? These are a word completion test, okay? And if I were to give this to you and then I said, hey, go do this while I grab some food, most people would be likely to see the word as soup. Versus if I said, okay, why don't you go ahead and do this while I take a quick shower, most people are now going to see that this word can be soap. Okay, so our context and our experiences around something shape our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. I just think this is crazy interesting, and we'll try to make some time so we can talk about this a little bit more. Another thing for us to think about, two more concepts for us to be aware of from Module 20 are Weber's Law and sensory adaptation. Okay, so Weber's Law says that two stimuli must differ by a minimum percentage. Okay, so what does that mean and who cares? Okay, so I put the picture here of this guy lifting weights, right? And so let's say this guy he's deadlifting 250 pounds. I don't know. I don't even know what a normal amount to deadlift is, okay? Would he feel it if you added 2 more pounds to his barbell? Probably not, okay? But let's say somebody had a 1 pound dumbbells, okay? So if you were to add 2 pounds to that, would you feel it? Absolutely, because it's significant. So what I'm saying is that it's not about the amount, but about the percentage in a change between two different stimuli, the 1 pound barbell or the 3 pound barbell. It's about the percentage of change in it will impact how much we feel it or experience it, okay? So that's really kind of what that's all about. Another example might be the TV volume or music volume, right? Maybe you have a sibling that plays music that's just way too loud, and you ask them to turn it down, and they turn it down 2 notches, right? That's probably not going to satisfy you. That's probably not going to make you happy. It's really about the percentage that they turned it down. So if they only had it on level 4 and they turned it down 2 notches, yeah, you're going to really hear that difference versus if they had it on volume 100 and they only take it down to 98, probably not different enough for you to experience the difference. So Weber's law states there's a certain threshold, a certain percentage that something has to change for you to be able to experience it, okay? And so sensory adaptation is the diminished sensitivity as a consequence of constant stimulation. So let's go over 3 examples, right? Let's say you come in from outside, you walk into a house where they're baking cookies, right? You're gonna smell that super intensely at the beginning, and then over time, you're just gonna your brain's gonna kind of accommodate for that being the smell of the house, and you're gonna smell it less intensely than you did when you first walked in the house. Maybe same thing as going out into the cold or out into the extreme heat, right? At the beginning, when your body goes in from a temperature regulated house to the outside, you really feel it, but over time your body sort of adjusts and you sort of acclimate to that climate. Maybe the same thing, I know, let's say you walk into a very loud dance and the music is blasting, and that moment you walk in, it's gonna feel so intense, but after you get going, you're dancing, you're there for 20, 30, 40 minutes or an hour, it just feels normal, okay? So, intro quickly to influence in perception. So really quickly, think about this. When you look at this picture, do you see an old woman kind of looking down with her head covered? Or do you see a young woman off to the side? So really quickly here, if you see the young woman, this would be her nose, her ear, her chin. If you see an older woman, this is her hair, this is whatever her head covering is, this is her eye, this is her nose, and this is her mouth, right? And your brain might go back and forth to it, this is what we're talking about with perception. We're all seeing the same stimulus, but our brains are processing it different. Another thing that I find really fascinating is a perceptual set, okay? And that's a mental predisposition to perceive one thing over another, okay? So think about this. If you read this from bottom to top versus you read this from left to right, this image right here is going to look different. Sorry about that, right? So if you read it down, this looks very much like a B, A, B, C, versus if you're predisposed to reading numbers, you're gonna see this as a 13, okay? So we're predisposed to see something based on the other things that are around it. And finally, the way we perceive stuff has to do with our context, our motivation, and our emotion, okay? So let's talk quickly about context, right? We see The Rock, right? He looks like a pretty big guy next to Kevin Hart versus if he's next to Shaq. Shaq looks giant. Then we see Shaq by Yao Ming, and now he doesn't really look like that tall of a guy, okay? When you hear the word morning, right, depends on what you've been thinking about, right? If you just woke up this morning and it's daylight out, you're probably thinking of morning, M-O-R-I-N-G, versus maybe you've been talking about losing a loved one. When you hear morning, you're gonna think of M-O-U-R-I-N-G, okay? Also motivation. How close or far something is is based on your experience. So people who, let's say, are thirsty and like really just wanting water in the desert are going to picture in their heads a bottle of water as much closer than it actually is. So be looking for those examples. How does context, motivation, and emotion change how we experience something? Last picture I want you guys to look at, and I want you to think, what do you see right away? Okay, then I want you to read the top there. It says, enjoy that brief moment where your brain tells you this is a photo of a crowd at a large concert. In fact, it's not. These are tractors picking cotton, right? But because most of us are not farmers, our brain is not predisposed to think like, oh, this is a tractor. A lot of us saw this as people's heads, and this is a stage. So I find this stuff to be fascinating. I hope that you do too. I hope that a lot of this makes sense. And that you watch the 2 videos that I've linked below. And then we're going to dive into looking at how the brain processes information from the eyes, from the ears, from the nose, from the mouth, etc. Okay, so thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.